The man who walked into Harlow Sinclair's garage that October morning didn't see a failing business. He saw 6 engines lined up against the back wall like gravestones, and he smiled. Harlow didn't notice the smile at first. He was under a '98 Silverado with a flashlight in his teeth, and his daughter Penny's voice in the back of his head, reminding him that her field trip permission slip was due Friday and that there was no milk left and that the left rear tire on her bike had gone flat again. Penny was 8, and she kept a running list of household problems the way other kids kept wish lists for Christmas. It was one of the things about her that made him want to cry and laugh at the same time, usually simultaneously, which he'd learned was possible only after Claire died. He heard boots on the concrete and slid out. The man was somewhere in his 60s, silver-haired, wearing a jacket that probably cost more than Harlow's truck. He had the kind of posture that came from decades of being listened to, and he was standing with his hands behind his back, looking at the engines. "You fixing those?" the man said without turning around. "Working on it," Harlow said. He sat up and wiped his hands on a rag. "Can I help you?" The man turned. His name, he said, was Edmund Foss. He owned the Foss Group, industrial equipment, commercial vehicles, a few other things. He said it the way people say things they've said 10,000 times and no longer think about. Harlow had heard of Foss Group. Most people in Kenmore had. The company had been headquartered 40 minutes north for 30 years, and Edmund Foss's face appeared on the occasional business magazine cover at the dentist's office. "Those are Mark VI diesel blocks," Foss said, nodding toward the wall. "They are. Where'd you get them?" Harlow told him. 3 months earlier, a fleet disposal company out of Calgary had sold them as scrap. 4 of them had cracked sleeves, 1 had a seized crankshaft, and 1 had damage that initially looked terminal, but turned out to be mostly cosmetic once he got into it. He'd bought all 6 for the price of good scrap metal. Foss looked at him for a moment. "You know what those are worth, rebuilt?" "I have a number in mind," Harlow said, "and you think you can do it." It wasn't quite a question. Harlow stood up fully. He was 6'1", broad across the shoulders from 20 years of actual work rather than the gym, and he had a way of being still that people sometimes mistook for patience. It wasn't patience. It was just that he'd learned a long time ago that not every statement needed a response. "I'll come back," Foss said. He looked around the garage once more, at the tools hung in their precise order on the pegboards, at the work log written in Harlow's careful hand on the whiteboard, at Penny's drawing of a blue dog taped to the wall above the parts cabinet. And he left. Harlow had come to Kenmore 4 years earlier, after Claire's accident, and after he'd handed in his notice at Meridian Automotive, where he'd spent 11 years as a senior powertrain engineer. People at Meridian hadn't understood that part. The salary, the title, the trajectory. He was 41 and had been quietly considered for a director role. His manager, a careful man named Bryce, who expressed concern only in the passive voice, told him that grief sometimes caused people to make decisions that were perhaps not optimally timed. Harlow had thanked him and cleared his desk. He'd bought the garage in Kenmore because it was 2 hours from the city and had a house attached to the back with a yard and a school 3 blocks away. Penny had just turned 5. She didn't fully understand what had happened to her mother yet, which meant Harlow was in the strange position of grieving alone while also explaining, in age-appropriate increments, something that he himself couldn't fully explain. The garage made sense. He'd grown up in his uncle's shop in Sudbury, and the logic of engines, the specific undeniable causality of them, had always been a kind of anchor. Things broke for reasons. Things could be fixed. He needed to be somewhere that was still true. The first 2 years were slow. Kenmore had a population of 6,002 other mechanics, one of whom had been there for 30 years and inspired loyalty of a near-religious intensity. Harlow picked up overflow work, fleet maintenance for a local trucking company, the occasional restoration project. He kept his rates fair and his work honest, and he didn't rush anything, which meant his reputation grew the way good reputations do, slowly, and from the right people. By the time he bought the 6 Mark VI engines, he was busy enough that buying them was a risk. He'd have to do the rebuild work at night and on weekends around the paying jobs. He'd have to pull Penny into the garage sometimes, set her up at the small desk in the corner with her homework and her colored pencils and her inexhaustible opinions about everything. She didn't mind. She'd grown up partly in this garage. She called the parts cabinet the library. Edmund Foss came back on a Thursday 16 days later. This time he brought a woman. She was younger than Foss, early 50s maybe, with the composed, watchful quality of someone who had learned to let other people talk first. She wore a dark coat, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, and she looked at the garage the same way Foss had, methodically, starting with the walls and ending with the engines. Her name was Helen Carver. She was, Foss explained, the chief operating officer of Foss Group's equipment division. Harlow wiped his hands and shook hers. He tells me you're rebuilding all 6, she said. That's the plan. What's your timeline? 4 months. Maybe 3.5 if nothing surprises me. Helen looked at the engine he was currently working on, the one with the seized crank, which he'd freed up and was now in the process of measuring for wear. May I? She said, and gestured toward the engine stand. He said yes. She leaned in and looked at the crank journal without touching it, the way someone looks at something they know well. You did this yourself? She said. Yes. You freed the crank? Yes. She straightened up. She and Foss exchanged a look that Harlow didn't try to interpret. These engines, Helen said, turning back to him, were part of a procurement contract that my company lost 2 years ago. We ordered 12 of them for a fleet retrofit. The contract was canceled mid-delivery, and the remaining 6 were left in a warehouse in Calgary. Our logistics team classified them as non-recoverable and disposed of them. She paused. I was told they were beyond repair. Harlow said nothing. They were not beyond repair, she said. No, he agreed. What happened next took Harlow some time to fully understand, partly because it unfolded slowly, and partly because he was busy. He had 3 other jobs running simultaneously. Penny had started a phase of asking detailed and philosophically complex questions about death every night at bedtime, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Edmund Foss called and offered to buy all 6 engines back, rebuilt, certified, and delivered at a price that Harlow wrote down on the back of a receipt and then looked at for a long time. He didn't say yes immediately. That was one of the things Claire used to tease him about, that he processed things internally and completely before speaking, which meant that in moments of significance he went very quiet. She'd learned to read the quality of the silence. He missed that more than he could say. He called his uncle in Sudbury. His uncle, who was 73 and had opinions about everything, and was wrong about perhaps 30% of them, listened to the whole thing and then said, "So someone smart finally noticed what you were doing. What's the problem?" "I want to make sure I understand what I'm agreeing to." "You're agreeing to get paid properly for once," his uncle said. "What else is there to understand?" Harlow said yes. The complications started in February. The rebuild on Engine 4 had gone well. Engine 5 was nearly done. He was sourcing parts for the last one, the one that had looked worst on arrival, but had turned out to have the best bones, when he got a call from Helen Carver. Her voice was careful in the way it got when something was wrong. "There's a problem with the contract," she said. "Not on our end, on yours." A man named Philip Greer had surfaced. He was the previous owner of the fleet disposal company in Calgary, and he had filed a claim asserting that the 6 engines had never been legitimately sold, that they'd been removed from the Foss Group warehouse without proper authorization, and that the disposal had been, as he put it, procedurally irregular. Harlow sat down on his shop stool. "He's claiming you don't have legal title to the engines," Helen said. "I have a bill of sale." "I know. Our lawyers have seen it. The issue is what Greer is saying about the disposal process. He's suggesting the person who authorized the sale didn't have the authority to do so." "Did they?" A pause. That's what we're trying to establish. Harlow put the phone down after the call and sat in the garage for a while. The engine on the stand was half-assembled, clean and precise, all its parts measured and fitted within tolerance. Through the window in the door that led to the house, he could see Penny at the kitchen table, doing homework, occasionally chewing the end of her pencil. He'd put 6 months of evenings and weekends into these engines. He'd spent money on parts. He'd turned down other work to keep the timeline. He picked the phone back up and called a lawyer he knew in town, a woman named Beverly, who handled commercial disputes and spoke directly. "Tell me everything," Beverly said. Philip Greer was not, it turned out, a straightforward person. Beverly's investigation, which she pursued with the methodical efficiency of someone who had learned that most legal messes are made by lazy people cutting corners, uncovered a pattern that predated Harlow entirely. The fleet disposal company had, under Greer's management, been running what amounted to a quiet double-billing scheme. Equipment would be classified as non-recoverable and written off by the original owner. It would then be sold through the disposal company at below-market rates to buyers with whom Greer had informal arrangements. Greer would collect the write-off documentation for the original owner and a second payment from the buyer. The engines Harlow had purchased had been part of this pattern. The key question was whether Harlow's purchase, made in good faith through what appeared to be a legitimate transaction, was protected. Beverly said she thought it was. But Greer is going to fight it because if he doesn't, his whole scheme unravels and he's looking at fraud charges. So he's using me as a shield, Harlow said. He's trying to, Beverly said. He picked the wrong person. What Beverly meant, and what became clear over the following weeks, was that Harlow's records were meticulous. He had every receipt, every measurement log, every parts invoice, every communication with the disposal company, all of it organized in the same careful way he organized everything. He'd taken photographs of each engine on arrival. He had the original inspection notes in his own handwriting, time-stamped. Greer's lawyer had presumably expected to find someone without documentation. He found instead a former powertrain engineer who had kept records the way other people keep breathing, automatically, completely, without needing to be reminded why. Helen Carver called in March. "I want to apologize," she said. "This situation came from our end. Greer was operating with the complicity of someone in our logistics department, someone who has since been terminated. The disposal was authorized by someone who wasn't authorized to authorize it, and Greer knew that when he made his arrangements. Harlow had suspected as much. How long has it been going on? We're still finding out. At least 4 years." She paused. The engines were ours to dispose of. The employee didn't have signing authority, but Greer didn't care about that because it gave him leverage later. If anyone asked questions, he could point to procedural irregularities on our side and create enough noise to walk away. And I was the person who asked questions. You were the person who did the work, Helen said. That's what made you visible. He thought about that for a while after he hung up. He'd bought 6 engines because he knew what they were worth when most people had already given up on them. He'd done the work because he couldn't not. Because his hands knew what to do with them before his head had fully decided to try. And somehow that had put him in the middle of something he hadn't asked for. He went back to work on Engine 6. Penny found out something was wrong in the way children find things out. Not because anyone told her, but because she noticed. She smiled at her desk. She noticed that her father was on the phone more than usual, and that he sometimes stood at the kitchen window in the evening, looking at nothing in particular, and that the engine on the stand in the garage wasn't getting finished. One night she came into the garage after dinner and sat at her desk without being asked and opened her homework folder. She worked in silence for 20 minutes. Then she said, without looking up, "Is it about the engines?" Harlow, who was cleaning a part that didn't need cleaning because he needed something to do with his hands, said, "Sort of. Are you going to lose them?" "I hope not." Penny considered this. She was 8, and she had Claire's forehead and his stubbornness, and a way of thinking through problems out loud that he found both exhausting and wonderful. "You fixed them," she said. "They were broken, and you fixed them." "I know. So they're yours." He almost said it's more complicated than that. He stopped himself. "Yeah," he said. "They are." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her homework. The legal resolution came in April. Beverly had connected with Foss Group's legal team, and together they'd built a case that was, as Beverly put it, very dull and very airtight. Harlow's purchase was legitimate. His title to the engines was valid. Greer's claim was dismissed. The fraud investigation, which had expanded beyond the engines to include 3 other disposal transactions, was handed to the RCMP. Harlow heard the news on a Tuesday afternoon. He was in the middle of the final assembly on Engine 6. He finished what he was doing before he called Beverly back, because the part he was fitting required a specific torque, and he didn't want to rush it. Beverly told him the decision. He thanked her. He hung up. He stood in the garage for a moment, looking at the 6 engines, all of them finished now, clean and correct, rebuilt from components that a warehouse in Calgary had classified as not worth keeping. He thought about the months of evenings. He thought about Penny at her desk, doing homework while he worked. He thought about his uncle saying, "What's the problem?" in that voice that cut through everything unnecessary. He called, Edmund Foss. I'll have them ready for pickup by the end of the month, he said. Helen Carver came with the transport team on a Friday. She stood in the garage while the engines were loaded, watching with the same attentive quiet she'd had the first time. When the last one was secured, she turned to Harlow. I want to ask you something, she said. Off the record, or whatever the equivalent is. He waited. When Greer filed the claim, you could have settled. You probably knew that. He would have taken 60 cents on the dollar and disappeared. I know, Harlow said. Why didn't you? He thought about how to answer that honestly. He looked at the empty space along the back wall where the engines had stood for 8 months. Because they were mine, he said. I found them. I did the work. I knew what they were when everyone else had already decided they weren't worth anything. He paused. You don't walk away from that. Helen looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Foss Group has a consulting contract we've been trying to fill for about 6 months. Powertrain assessment, fleet procurement evaluation. It's part-time, remote. You'd keep the garage. She paused. Edmund wanted me to mention it. Harlow said he'd think about it. He did think about it, for about 4 days, which, for him, was fast. He talked to his uncle, who said obviously yes. He talked to Penny, who asked if it meant he'd be home more or less. And when he said more or less the same, she said okay, and asked if they could have pancakes for dinner. He called Helen on a Wednesday morning and said yes. The thing Harlow thought about later. Not often, but sometimes, usually when he was doing something quiet and repetitive, like cleaning threads or measuring bearing clearance, was the moment on that first Tuesday when Edmund Foss had walked into the garage and smiled. He'd thought about that smile for months without fully understanding it. It hadn't been a smile of condescension or pity or the particular smile of a wealthy person encountering something quaint. It had been the smile of recognition. Foss had known what the engines were. He'd known what it meant, that someone had found them and was working on them. And he'd come back, because in his experience, 60-odd years of building and losing and building again, the kind of person who crouched down in a garage and saw potential in something everyone else had written off was the kind of person worth knowing. Penny was 9 now. She'd started helping with small jobs, holding things, fetching tools, asking questions that were sometimes annoying and sometimes clarifying in ways that stopped Harlow short. She had a theory that engines were like people. Most of the damage was fixable, if you knew where to look and weren't afraid to take things apart to find out. He hadn't told her that was right. He hadn't needed to. She already knew.